It started with a piece of paper, an ordinary, unremarkable flyer fluttering in the breeze on the community notice board outside my favorite coffee shop. I was there late one evening, nursing a bitter espresso and hoping it might counteract the restless nights that had been haunting me. My insomnia wasn't just sleeplessness. It was an unwelcome awakening to a strange kind of silence, the kind that made you feel as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The flyer was the answer to a prayer I hadn't dared to voice aloud. Volunteers wanted, insomnia study, generous compensation, 3 days. It was vague, but that only made it more alluring. Sleep had become an elusive stranger to me, slipping away whenever I reached for it. The thought of understanding why, of finally being able to close my eyes without fear of the void waiting behind them, was too tempting to resist. The facility was on the outskirts of town, in a part of the city no one had any reason to visit. I arrived at dusk, the sky a sickly orange bruise as the sun surrendered to night. The building itself loomed at the end of a cracked asphalt road, its structure cold and impersonal, a gray monolith in a sea of overgrown weeds. Inside, the air was sterile, humming with fluorescent lights and the faint whir of machinery. Dr. Havens greeted me in the lobby. She was younger than I'd expected, her sharp features softened only by a pair of horn-rimmed glasses. Her voice was calm, almost hypnotic, as she explained the terms of the experiment. 3 days, no sleep. We'll monitor your vitals, observe your mental state. If you complete the study, you'll be generously compensated. She smiled, but her eyes didn't. I wasn't alone. 4 other participants had also answered the call. Felix was a wiry man in his 40s, constantly scratching at his arms as though trying to claw through his skin. Claire, a timid woman in her 30s, muttered to herself, her lips moving in a frantic rhythm only she could understand. 2 others, Adam and Lily, avoided eye contact altogether, their faces pale and drawn. As we were led to our rooms, the dread began to seep in. Each room was identical, stark white walls, a single cot, and a mirror that I was certain was two-way. The door locked from the outside. "Safety precautions," Dr. Havens said when I asked about it. Her smile lingered a moment too long. By the first night, the unease had taken root. The sterile walls seemed to breathe, their faint hum growing louder as the hours crawled by. Cameras watched my every move, their red lights blinking in synchrony, like the unblinking eyes of some unseen predator. The other participants reacted to the sleeplessness in strange and unsettling ways. Felix's scratching grew more violent, the sound of his nails dragging across his skin, grating like nails on a chalkboard. Claire whispered in bursts now, her sentences incoherent and frantic. Adam sat in the corner of his room, his body unnaturally still, while Lily paced incessantly, her shadow dancing on the walls like a restless specter. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came in the form of a fleeting shadow. It darted across the corner of my vision, so quick I might have dismissed it as a trick of my tired mind. But it happened again, and again. By the 3rd time, I was certain I wasn't imagining it. When I mentioned it to Dr. Havens during her nightly check-in, she tilted her head, her pen poised above her clipboard. "Hallucinations are a common side effect of sleep deprivation," she said, her tone clinical. But this wasn't a hallucination. It was something else. By the 2nd night, the shadows had become bolder. They lingered longer, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke caught in a draft. The air in the facility felt heavier, pressing down on my chest until every breath became a struggle. Felix was the first to break. He burst into the common area, his eyes wild, and screamed that he could feel them crawling under his skin. "They're inside me!" he shouted, clawing at his arms until blood dripped onto the cold tile floor. Dr. Havens and her team sedated him, wheeling him out of the room without so much as a word of explanation. He didn't come back. That night, the temperature in my room plummeted. I wrapped myself in the thin blanket provided, but it did little to stop the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The shadows grew darker, denser, and I could hear faint whispers just beyond the edge of comprehension. Claire's sobbing echoed through the halls, interspersed with the occasional desperate shout of, "Make it stop! Please make it stop!" I wanted to leave, but the doors were locked. The cameras followed me as I paced, their red lights blinking in a slow, mocking rhythm. When I looked into the mirror, my reflection seemed wrong, my face too pale, my eyes too wide, staring back at me with a fear that I couldn't shake. Somewhere deep in the building, a low, rumbling noise reverberated through the walls. It sounded almost like laughter. The third night began in silence, a silence so profound it felt like a living thing, coiling around my chest and squeezing until I could barely breathe. Felix's absence hung heavy in the air, a grim reminder that whatever was happening here wasn't just in our heads. Claire hadn't stopped crying. Her sobs echoed faintly through the walls, a haunting backdrop to the growing unease in my own mind. I tried to block it out, pressing my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to seep through, like water finding cracks in a dam. Dr. Havens didn't visit that night. The researchers were conspicuously absent, leaving us alone with the cameras and whatever it was that lurked in the shadows. It wasn't long before Claire's sobbing turned to screams. "They're here!" she shrieked, her voice raw and ragged. "They're in the walls!" The sound of a struggle followed, a crash, a scream cut short, and then silence again. I pressed my face to the small window in my door, straining to see what had happened, but the hallway was empty. The air felt colder and the oppressive silence returned, now heavier with the weight of something unseen. That was when the lights flickered. At first it was subtle, a slight dimming, as though the power was faltering. Then they blinked off completely, plunging the facility into darkness. I scrambled to find the emergency flashlight they'd given us, the small cone of light barely enough to illuminate the room. The shadows seemed to move now, no longer confined to the edges of my vision. They slithered along the walls, coalescing into shapes that didn't belong, shapes that twisted and writhed like living nightmares. The whispers grew louder. I couldn't understand the words, but they filled my head, a cacophony of low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. "Let me out," I shouted, my voice cracking. I pounded on the door, but no one answered. The cameras above me blinked their red lights in eerie synchronization, as if mocking my panic. The air grew heavier, colder, until my breath came out in visible puffs. The shadows crept closer, their movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring my fear. That was when the door to my room unlocked with a soft click. I hesitated. I didn't want to step into the hallway, but staying in the room felt like an invitation for whatever was out there to come for me. I took a tentative step outside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The hallway was empty. The faint scent of something metallic lingered in the air, and I tried not to think about what it might be. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. A shadow moved at the far end of the hallway, too large, too solid to be a trick of the light. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It didn't move like a person. It glided, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. I turned and ran. The hallways twisted and turned like a labyrinth, their sterile walls stretching endlessly in every direction. No matter which way I went, I couldn't find the exit. My flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering as though something were draining its power. The whispers followed me. They grew louder, more insistent, their guttural tones rising to a fever pitch. "What do you want?" I screamed, spinning around, but there was no answer, only the shifting shadows creeping closer. I stumbled into the common area, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the emergency lights, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Claire was there, or what was left of her. She sat slumped in the corner, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her lifeless eyes wide open and staring into nothing. The sight sent a jolt of terror through me, and I backed away, only to trip over something soft. It was Adam. His body lay sprawled on the floor, his face contorted in an expression of pure agony. His hands were clutching his throat as though trying to claw something out. A low, rumbling laugh echoed through the room. It wasn't human. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadows had gathered in the center of the room, coalescing into a shape that defied explanation. It was tall, its form shifting and rippling like water. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were hollow voids that seemed to pull the light into them. "You are ours now," the whisper said, but this time they weren't in my head. They came from the shadow itself, its voice a low, guttural rasp that resonated deep in my bones. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadow stretched toward me, its tendrils reaching out like claws. Desperation overtook me. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness. The creature recoiled, its form breaking apart like smoke caught in a breeze. I didn't wait to see if it would recover. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the cold tile floor. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the sound of something following me, a wet, slithering noise that sent shivers down my spine. Finally, I found the door to the control room. I threw it open and locked it behind me, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The room was filled with monitors, each one displaying a feed from the facility's cameras. What I saw made my blood run cold. The shadows were everywhere. They moved through the hallways, their forms sliding under doors, wrapping around the remaining participants like living nooses. Dr. Havens was on one of the screens, standing perfectly still as a shadow loomed over her. She didn't resist. She simply smiled as it consumed her. The laughter returned, louder now, filling the small room. I turned to the corner and saw it. The shadow had followed me, and this time, there was nowhere to run. The shadow filled the room, its presence sucking the air from my lungs. The faint glow of the monitors cast its form in sharp, inhuman relief, jagged edges and shifting angles that defied the laws of physics. Its void-like eyes bored into me, pulling at my mind with an irresistible force. I scrambled backward, my body trembling as I searched for anything to defend myself. My hand found a metal clipboard on the console. Gripping it tightly, I swung wildly, but the shadow only laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that vibrated through my skull. "You cannot fight us," it hissed, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones, some human, some unearthly. "You opened the door, and now you belong to us." The monitors flickered, the screens distorting into grotesque images. Faces twisted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. I recognized Felix, Claire, Adam, and Lily among them, their expressions frozen in terror as the shadow consumed them. My own face appeared next, pale and gaunt, my eyes wide with fear. "No!" I screamed, slamming my fist against the console. "This isn't real!" The shadow moved closer, its tendrils curling around me, cold and wet, like the touch of something dredged from a forgotten abyss. I felt its presence invading my mind, a creeping fog that blurred the edges of reality. Flashes of memories that weren't mine assaulted me. People from other experiments, their final moments etched into the fabric of the shadow. It fed on us, on our fear, on our refusal to sleep. We had become its sustenance, its playthings. In a moment of clarity, I remembered the emergency lights. My trembling hand found the switch on the wall, a large red lever labeled Override. Without hesitation, I pulled it. The room was flooded with harsh white light. The shadow screamed, a high-pitched wail that pierced my ears and sent the monitors shattering in a burst of sparks. Its form writhed and twisted, shrinking away from the light, its tendrils dissolving like smoke. But it wasn't gone. Not completely. The whispers remained, faint but insistent, as I staggered out of the control room and into the labyrinthine hallways. The emergency lights illuminated the carnage, bloody smears on the walls, lifeless bodies of the other participants crumpled like discarded dolls. I didn't stop to check for survivors. I ran, the faint sound of wet, slithering movement echoing behind me. The facility's main doors were unlocked, swinging open into the cold night air. I stumbled out, gasping, my lungs burning with the effort. The quiet of the industrial district felt surreal, the world outside untouched by the horrors I had endured. But the shadows weren't done with me. Even now, as I sit in the safety of my apartment, I can feel them watching. The lights flicker sometimes, and I catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision. The whispers have followed me, growing louder with each sleepless night. I don't know how much longer I can resist. My body is failing, my mind unraveling. The experiment never ended. It was just the beginning.